1 Samuel 27, the Bible reads. And David said in his heart, I shall not perish one day by the hand of Saul. There is nothing better for me than that I should speedily escape into the land of the Philistines, and Saul shall despair of me to seek me any more in any coast of Israel. So shall I escape out of his hand. And David arose, and he passed over with the 600 men that were with him, and Achish the son of Maoch, king of Gath. And David dwelt with Achish at Gath, he and his men, every man with his household, even David with his 2 wives, Ahinoam the Jezreelitess, and Abigail the Carmelitess, Nabal's wife. And it was told Saul that David was fled to Gath, and he sought no more again for him. And David said unto Achish, If I have now found grace in thine eyes, let them give me a place in some town in the country, that I may dwell there. Why should thy servant dwell in the royal city with thee? Then Achish gave him Ziklag that day, wherefore Ziklag pertaineth unto the kings of Judah unto this day. And the time that David dwelt in the country of the Philistines was a full year and 4 months, and David and his men went up and invaded the Geshurites and the Gezerites and the Amalekites, for those nations were of old the inhabitants of the land, as thou goest to Shur, even unto the land of Egypt. And David smote the land and left neither man nor woman alive, and took away the sheep and the oxen and the asses and the camels and the apparel, and returned, and came to Achish. And Achish said, Whither have ye made a road today? And David said, Against the south of Judah, and against the south of the Jerahmeelites, and against the south of the Kenites. And David saved neither man nor woman alive to bring tidings to Gath, saying, Lest they should tell on us, saying, So did David, and so will be his manner all the while he dwelleth in the country of the Philistines. And Achish believed David, saying, He hath made his people Israel utterly to abhor him. Therefore he shall be my servant forever. Brother Mateo, would you pray for us?
Heavenly Father, I pray that you would please bless us with another fine sermon this Sunday morning. I pray that the preacher would be full of your spirit and help us, Lord, to be attentive to your word and get our instruction from our mind. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen.
Amen. Thanks, Mateo. Good morning. It's okay. So this was a short chapter, so short in fact, that I'll probably be wrapped up here in about 5 minutes. We'll just do something real quick. She knows it's not true. All right, that's a little bit better. So, short chapter. Last night I sent the Clemens brothers, as I call them. Sounds like they need to have their own video game. I'd play that game if you guys had a video game. I sent them a test, and they passed. Good job, you guys. I played it pretty straight. I said, "Hey guys, do you need anything printed for tomorrow?" And they said, "Nope, you're up." And I was like, "Good job, passed the test." So just to be sure that I had everything in order, around 9-10 p.m. last night, I went ahead and I did a second read through on my notes I had prepared for this morning's message.
Good job.
It's a joke. All right. So I just found out last night that I had 1 Samuel 27 because of all the confusion with California. You guys are never allowed to leave again, by the way. Okay. We have a lot to learn here in these 12 verses, as we always do. But I was surprised. So I had my little laptop, and I was reading through everything. I usually do a split screen. This is the method of my madness. So don't tell anyone, it's trademarked. I basically just have a half screen over here of the Blue Letter Bible and then a half screen over here of Microsoft Word. We're very high tech at the Smith household. And as I started reading through it, it took me like 3 or 4 verses to realize the exact direction I wanted to go. So luckily, God was good, like we sang about this morning. And I wasn't up until 3 a.m. trying to come up with sermon notes. And I'm really excited about it. So the title of this morning's message and the 12 verses that we're going to get into is David's Disappearance, Deception, and Debauchery. Alliteration. And that's what we're going to talk about today. Here's a little preface for what I found out last night it's not new to us. There's nothing new under the sun. But it was really kind of drilled down deeper in that concrete, cemented, as it were. I never do this. Actually, last night was the first time I've ever done this, whether on a mobile app or online at the Blue Letter Bible. Blue Letter Bible is okay, but it's pretty much the most ecumenical app that you'll ever use. And what I mean by that is under one roof, they have every version that you've ever heard of and haven't heard of, and then they have commentaries from every person and resource that you would have never heard of if they weren't listed there. Sort of the equivalent of a blue check mark on Twitter. That's kind of how Blue Letter Bible app operates. However, the safe space or the safe bubble with the BLB, the Blue Letter Bible, is just to select KJV, so you're actually reading the Bible, and then you can take all the white noise and the static and you can cast it off to the side. So that's what I do. Well, last night, almost as an experiment, I wanted to see what do most people feel about 1 Samuel 27, because it's not a complimentary type chapter on David's character and conduct. Well, what I came to find out was that men of such renown, such as John MacArthur, and then other people who you would have never heard of, I clicked around a little bit. And disclaimer, I didn't do this for any guidance on sermon preparation because we have no need that man should teach us, but the Holy Spirit guides us. I just wanted to see what's up. So I clicked on it, and the one thing I found is that you can excuse and equivocate your way around anything. And that's exactly what these guys were doing. So it was interesting, and I almost wished, maybe just for today's sermon, I had some sort of a pull-down sheet behind me and a projector to do a quick slideshow to show you these quotes, because it's sermon notes from these men, these pastors over the past century. And they would talk themselves out of anything. So they basically painted David in this amazing picture, the height of Christian character and conduct, and why it was okay, and not only excusable, but perhaps even honorable that he slaughtered all these men, women, and children. And I got to the point where I was like, okay, you know what? Either I'm just completely off my rocker here, and maybe I'm reading these 12 verses wrong that have been preserved in English, or maybe they are. But whatever the case is, all I can do to you guys is be faithful and try my best to remain grounded, rooted, and sure in Scripture while I'm behind the pulpit every 3 weeks. And so that's what I'm going to do this morning. So I'm going to abandon the so-called wisdom of these guys, and whether you want to refer to them as heretics or not, none of that matters. What I'm going to do is we're going to break this down, 12 quick verses, and I think there's a lot that we can come out from that on the other end. So here's our introduction. David's disappearance, deception, and debauchery. So chapter 27 starts with a remedy for disaster. This is really a callback to something we talked about very recently, the last time that I was up here. David's reasoning within his heart. That's the first thing we see. As a matter of fact, let's read it. It's a pretty quick verse here. And David said in his heart, there's his first tripwire, I shall now perish one day by the hand of Saul. There is nothing better for me than that I should speedily escape into the land of the Philistines, and Saul shall despair of me to seek me any more in any coast of Israel. So shall I escape out of his hand. So that's his first move, is based out of paranoia, and we're going to get into how chapter 26 ends, that we heard from last week. He does this very dramatic turnabout. Why is that? Because he's reasoning within his own heart. So he makes his own half-baked plans for his great escape by relying on nothing more than a self-guided tour. He's inventing all of these things in his imagination. Remember, this violent 180-degree pivot in David's behavior comes immediately after chapter 26 wraps up with what? This is when Saul gives David the verbal equivalent of a reconciliatory bro hug, basically. And we're going to go back and we're going to take a quick look at that. So what David's doing is he's trying to see through that thin veil of Saul's compliments, and Saul's basically insulating him from danger into the future. That's what Saul does. He kind of cuts that umbilical cord of hatred where they're playing Benny Hill all across Israel, and he's chasing him, and then David's chasing Saul and cutting off road pieces and stealing his water canteen. They basically squash all of that, but now, all of a sudden, David has a change of heart. He reasons within his own heart, and he goes on his whole escape escapade. To me, all of this planning, this irrationality, stings of too little too lateness on David's behalf. As a matter of fact, David runs for his life from the king who sat idle on his throne a short while ago, while David was used mightily by God with a sling and a stone. So what's happened in David's life? A lot has happened between then and now. So before we get into the actual message, the very last verse of chapter 26, you're really close there if you're in the the text there in 27. So 26:25. This is how it wrapped up. Then Saul, and remember, I'm going to paint the picture for you. Basically, David's far enough away that he's out of harm's way from Saul. And Saul wakes up, he comes to, the Lord put a sleep over him and his bodyguards and all of that. And he's like, what? Where, you guys, where's my spear and my water? Who did it? Then he sees David off in the distance, and basically David's like, hey, look, this is the last time. I really want to put this beef behind us. What say you? And Saul's like, here's his response. Then said Saul to David, blessed be thou, my son David. Thou shalt both do great things, and also shalt still prevail. So David went on his way, and Saul returned to his place. Well, that seems pretty straightforward. However, I think if anything, David smells blood in the water, and this kind of stings of past mistakes repeated. Because we kind of had the same encounter at the cave with the robe, and he cut off a little piece of his garment, his skirt. So then he goes on his escape. So in verses 2 to 3, right here in chapter 27 this morning, David and his 600 legion here, they play keep up while David befriends Gath's prince. So he basically goes and he does what David does best. He kind of sees like, hey, who's the master of the land? Who's the head honcho around here? Who's going to get me past all the velvet ropes at the nightclubs? And it just happens to be the prince. Well, we've seen this pattern before as he was trying to climb the ladder in Israel earlier in his life. Now, verse 4, the big reveal to Saul becomes a big nothing burger. So check this out. Basically, Saul either still has spies out in the land, or more likely what's happening is someone spots David out there while he's kind of living at large with the prince. He's got his 600 groupies around him, and they're just kind of all living it up with the Philistines in Gath. And then they come back to Saul. It's some guy that probably thinks he's going to be rewarded with riches. Hey, I found your mortal enemy, David. He's hanging out in Gath with the prince. And here's Saul's response in verse 4. And it was told to Saul that David was fled to Gath, and he sought no more again for him. I mean, it's pretty simple. Basically, it's all wrapped up with a bow on it, and Saul doesn't care. David has created this own paranoia in his head that he's still hot on his heels. And it's this back and forth, sort of like superhero, supervillain type thing, where there's one person who always does good, there's another person who always does bad. But Saul is doing what he should have done the entire time. He's back at his home, he's back in his castle, he's surrounded by his advisors, and he's running the nation. So that's what he should be doing, right? The CEO of a company or the president or a chairman of a company would never just abandon his post and go on an indefinite vacation. That would be irresponsible. So he's finally doing what he's doing, but we see this about face in what David's doing. So now David actually has this freedom zone to do whatever he wants, to be used by God. And let's see what he does with that freedom as we read on. So this ordeal, by the way, reminds me of Jonah, which is, easy to find. It's in the same titled book. But so much wasted time trying to avoid and disobey God. And we know how that all played out. He was brought out of his nap in the ship. They exchanged some words, and then he got swallowed up. But this is what happened. David's band of 600 vagabonds and multiplying wives, by the way, the Bible makes mention of that. He wasn't too busy to grab him some harem and marry him, are in hiding needlessly at this point. Because Saul's interest level in the continued pursuit around Israel has grinded to zero. He's done. So Saul has given up this whole pursuit. He's blessed him on his way. He's like, you're going to do great things. And then he goes back to enjoy the rest of the time managing and overseeing his kingdom. That's what's going on. Now, in verse 5, David asks for something, as he always does. He asks for some free real estate. Now, when David makes an ask, he really makes an ask. So, whereas most friends ask for help moving into a new house, or, to borrow someone's pickup truck to maybe move a few dressers and sofas, David just goes for the whole enchilada. He's like, hey, listen, we've become pretty good buddies lately. You got any cities laying around that maybe I could have? I got these 600 guys with me, and they just won't leave me alone. But look, just somewhere in the country. Don't make a big fuss out of it, Prince. I mean, I'll be cool with whatever. So he doesn't just ask. In verse 5, we'll read through it. He doesn't just say, can I have a place? Can I have like a humble abode? I mean, I want to stay here. I want to remain loyal to you, to Gath. And I think we got a good thing going on here. You got like a log cabin somewhere you can give me? That's not what he asks for. He asks for a town. Let's read it. So verse 5 says, and David said unto Achish, If I have now found grace in thine eyes, let them give me a place in some town in the country, that I may dwell there. For why should thy servant dwell in the royal city with thee? We're going to go into a verse here in just a moment, and it's going to talk about how his 600 also followed him. So he was either given a town, as this verse indicates, or he was given the biggest hotel in Gath, with 600 plus one penthouse rooms. So I think we know how that all unfolded. So now some time has definitely passed. We know that since he arrived at Gath, it's not as though he just introduced himself and shook hands with Achish. Some time has passed to where they've kind of created this friendship. How do we know that? Well, because David says, if I found favor in your eyes, not a first impression. Hey, maybe you've heard of my legends. Maybe you've even heard that once upon a time I killed a giant from your land. And hey, don't hold that against me. But no, we can actually see some things have developed. And the one thing that we know about David is that he is literally a lyricist. The guy is a wordsmith. He can weave together these poems and songs, as we see in the Bible, that no one else can do. So David is very cunning with his words. And it's my supposition that I believe we can prove through Scripture that he's using that power that God has given him, that talent of the silver tongue, in order to undermine and befriend Achish. And he does so deceitfully. So let's look a little bit further into that. And by the way, not to be missed here, the flattery, which, the Bible talks a whole lot about. Actually, Sarah shared a verse with me about that last night. I don't even know why. It was in context. We were getting ready to fall asleep, and you were talking about, was it Proverbs? Was it? So it was basically, when you flatter someone, or when you rebuke someone, you'll actually grow in friendship, right? And so what David's doing here is he's using his flattery in order to gain himself some real estate. Why should I dwell in the royal city with thee? I mean, how humble does that sound, right? If you're really trying to butter someone up and you're a house guest for a short period of time, hey, listen, I'm a burden. I mean, my guys, they're insatiable. These 600 dudes that are with me, I know they keep raiding your refrigerator. I'm so sorry. I don't plan on this to be indefinite. Listen, if you got somewhere out in the country that you can just sign the deed over to me, we'll be out of your hair, lickety-split. Like, I can just see this whole scene unfolding because a lot of us have larceny in us. That's the flesh. We can relate to that. And we know that there's certain words, phrases, there's certain postures we can take in order to get something that we want. We just always have to guard ourselves against that. So this is the same as when David, in his earlier ladder climbing days, played this card with Saul when he put on the whole facade about not being worthy to be the king's son-in-law. Well, obviously you were. I mean, you went out and you waged war and collected, basketfuls of foreskins. Actually, you did double than was asked of you. You wanted to be a part of the royal family so much. So this guy is basically swinging from one branch to the next in order to continue pumping up his circumstances in life. And that's David's MO. In verses 6 and 7, we're already to the middle or the meat here of chapter 27. David spends about 16 months in his new bed and breakfast. So he's got things good. I mean, he's living large. He's not being chased or pursued anymore. He's not being persecuted. Let's see what he does with his time now. In the brief account of David's request to Achish for that house in the country, there's no mention of any requested accommodations for his 600 men. Not in the verse that we just read in verse 5, leading up to this. So that means that either David was just jockeying for himself and hoping that, these people just disappeared. Because when we were introduced to these people that were following him from cave to cave, how did the Bible describe them? Basically as social pariahs. The people that wanted to disconnect themselves from society. And these aren't anarchists in the best ways that just want to garden and eat organic and they don't want to be taxed to death by the IRS and unplugged from the grid. These are people that were probably, likely, it's my opinion, were cast out of society, not people that remove themselves from society. So it wasn't by choice. So, yeah, it really does seem like David looking out for number one here. But nonetheless, after all this unfolds, David moves in, cozies up, and settles down for what I like to think of as an extended escapecation for the long haul in his own city. However, how long does this appease David? Not for long. The Bible tells us, it actually gives us a really specific amount of years and months, 16 months. what happens at the expiration of that 16 months? Now, if you or I or any reasonable person was literally granted a plot of land by some prince or someone who had the power to do so, we'd be really happy. We'd never have a mortgage. We never have to worry about providing for our own and our family. It would all just be served up to us on trays. You know, I'm basically picturing David surrounded by all those little cornucopias and those horns with the fruit overflowing. That's his lifestyle at this point. No more caves for David. But what does he do? It's not enough. So at the end of that 16 months, he's like, well, I'm bored. Everybody get your weapons. Let's go do some killing. And that's what happens after this. So David's chickens of ambition, as it seems, have finally come home to roost. Because that's his character. So in verses 8 and 9, we're just a quick 4 verses from the end of the chapter here. This is what happened. David goes from a hermit to just outright homicidal. Now that David's become pals with the prince, he lives in his own city. He's free and clear of Saul's pursuit. There's no persecution going on. And he's surrounded by these 600 yes men. You know, all these guys are like, yeah, David, oh, wow. Hey, the way that you did nothing today, nobody could make it look better than you, David. So these are all adoring fanboys that are following him around. And by the way, there's danger in that. That's a really big pitfall. Because when we lose our own accountability and we're surrounded by people, whether it's colleagues, whether it's brethren in the church, and everyone's saying, you can do no wrong, you're awesome, that sermon was great, slam dunk, shattered backboard, you're the man. That's a lot of the times where our hubris, our arrogance, our pridefulness, even in spirituality, can start to fester and mutate into something horrible. So we also have to guard ourselves against that. So rather than relaxing in his own oasis of luxury, David, he decides to massacre no less than not 1, not 2, but 3 nations. And the Bible actually goes into that. So we're not talking little village towns, you know, where they just got done putting the mud on their grass roof. We're talking about actual nations or countries. Let's read the verses so we can get the context for it. So we're back in chapter 27, verses 8 and 9. And David and his men went up and invaded. Yeah, good. Okay, I got that. The Gershurites. And, here's number 2, the Gezerites and the Amalekites. So there's our 1, 2, 3. For those nations were of old and the inhabitants of the land. What did the Bible just say? It said nations. Those nations were of old. So not only are they nations, but these aren't little pop-ups. These aren't little startups where, you know, someone throws money into a GoFundMe and they build a couple shacks. These are nations that have been established. These are cities of old. So they've been around for a while. This goes on here into verse 9. It says, and David, and of course by extension, the 600 he took with him, smote the land and left neither man nor woman alive, and took away the sheep and the oxen and the asses and the camels and the apparel in return and came to Achish. Basically what he did, he killed everybody, so there's no witnesses, there's no one to tell tall tales and come back to Achish, which is why David now becomes the tall tale teller. When he gets approached on the last 2 verses of the chapter by Achish, and he breaks into everyone's vaults. He takes all their goods, all their money, all their diamonds, because this is filthy lucre. This is what David wants, because whatever he was being given by the state, the welfare by this Prince Achish and his plot of land, it wasn't enough. And that's the cancer that David is suffering from, spiritually speaking. So whereas most people, especially, we can relate to this. When they go stir crazy because you've been locked inside too long, whether you now work from home, whether your employer said, hey, just phone it in. We can do Zoom calls. You guys can continue your career. Just give us a good solid 40 hours a week. Don't come in because germs. So whether that's what's going on here, you guys can relate to David's situation. He doesn't feel like he has a purpose. And I've been there. I know a lot of you guys have probably been there, whether you're between jobs, whether you're looking to start a family and you want your purpose to be raising godly family as a heritage unto the Lord. We all have goals and ambitions. But rather than making a godly purpose, David decides, I'm just going to go steal everybody's stuff. And then I'm going to give a little bit as tribute to Prince Achish, and I'm going to keep the rest for myself. Haven't we seen this before in the Bible in many, many circumstances? People get swallowed up. People die on the spot. They basically say we gave everything to the church, and then they really didn't give everything to the church. So we see a lot of false pretenses going on here. Now take notice how David is very surgical in his refusal to leave that single man or woman, as the Bible tells us, alive. So when I get stir crazy. A lot of the times I like to go to an aquarium. I like to go to a puppy store, maybe hold a couple puppies, and then have Sarah convince me that we don't need it anymore. And I don't, so I put it back. But that's how I release my stress. Punching pillows doesn't do it for me. I like to go and I like to get outside, maybe hike, breathe some fresh air. Some people write angry notes, wad them up, throw them in the trash can, whatever. But David goes in another direction. Let's see what that direction was. We're 3 verses down until the end of the chapter. By the way, after David's confiscation of all that wealth, he still isn't happy. That's kind of worthy of a moment of pause for us. Because I know that if anyone is 1 or 100% like me in any way, sometimes we can allow ourselves to have our happiness, our joyfulness, our freedom in this life dictated by the amount of commas and zeros in our bank account. But what happens with David, what happens with everyone in that pursuit of money, of filthy lucre, like I just talked about? He still isn't happy. It seems as though David's focus wasn't on serving God by finalizing an age-old prophecy of destruction. That's one of the commentaries that I had read last night. But merely on lining his pockets while enjoying his newfound prince-sponsored impunity. So now David's not just rich, he's above the law. Now, I can think of 10 people off the top of my head, and we won't get into that. But current day, politics, everything that affects us, these regulators, these legislators, the people who have been placed in power. And if you know anything about me, I don't believe in elections, I believe in selections. And why? Well, because we see that beast system coming into power, that full antichrist system. And now, whoever's really in charge, the God of this world, we know who that is because it's told to us in the Bible, he has his thumb down on the fast forward button in Earth 2021. But things never change back here in David's day. So we'll continue taking a look at that. We gain an accurate picture of someone's character by how they conduct themselves when power is in their hand. There's really no truer statement. This reveals who they are truly, unclouded by false piety or humility, which David has a pretty impressive track record of having. He's good at it. David is showing his true colors through warmongering, treason, and genocide. These are not the hallmarks of the ruddy youth whose father neglected to even present him for leadership a few recent years ago. This was a guy that would tend the sheep. This is a guy that picked up the satchel, grabbed some stones from the creek out back, and went to war against the giant. What happened to David? He was not a good owner of power, responsibility, fame, and status. He is a classic example of someone that started to believe the hype. So in verses 10 to 12, this is where we see really things come full circle. David's deliverance from Saul, that's done. David's cowardice, the way that he takes 600 men. Because remember, I often try to talk about this when I get a chance to speak. It's not just the fact that he took these 600 guys and he went out and slaughtered 3 countries or nations, as the Bible calls them. It's the fact that he was able to do so efficiently. Now, 600 guys, if we were to try to fill this church building with 600 people, we couldn't do it. It's a large group of people, but it's not an army. It's not a battalion. It's not a contingency of well-trained soldiers. This isn't from like the movie 300 where everyone has been born and bred in order to become a warrior. So what that tells me is that rather than these guys being skilled weapons of warfare and warriors, these are just guys with swords. So who are they attacking? Mostly the old, the infirmed, the defenseless. Because there would be no way that 600 people could defeat 3 nations if they put up a fight. And to draw a pretty clear parallel to what's going on today, we might not have a sword and a sheath, and we might not have slings and stones, things like that. But a lot of people are basically allowing their tails to be wagged and kowtowing to the government, telling them, don't worry about those masks. As a matter of fact, don't even go out and buy masks. Our health practitioners need those. 3 months later. You know what? We're going to mandate masks. We have found that there's enough evidence to go ahead and say, get yourself some masks. And as a matter of fact, don't go to the movie theater, don't go to the mall, don't go to work, don't go to school without wearing a mask. Another 3 months later. Hey, if you're vaccinated, masks, that's a waste of time. There's people that need it more than you. 3 months later. Hey, yeah, the whole thing about that, there's this new variant circling around. I don't know if you guys have heard of it. It is not playing games. People are dropping like flies. Don't ask us for the stats. So we're going to go ahead and flip-flop on our floppity flip-flop, and we're going to go ahead and tell you to put the masks back on. And by the way, we're no longer fighting the disease against an infection. Now we're fighting a disease against those who haven't been vaccinated. So just in case you guys didn't have enough division between your amount of skin pigmentation, your income status, your religious choice, we're going to give you another one into the ring, and we're just going to make a chicken fight it out while we reach into our pockets with billions of dollars and we just watch and eat popcorn, okay? Get your mask on. That's basically what's going on now. So again, there's nothing new under the sun. We see the division happening here. David's talent for lying is only matched by his coveting, lust-fueled, greedy gain of status. David wants to be the man. He just does. And you know what else makes that a little bit harder for him to fight against? The fact that God said, you're going to be the man. You're going to be better than Saul. You're next up. Get ready. You're going to be the leader. And so David is believing these things because he is a chosen person. And a lot of harm can come from that. You can be chosen, but then you can deviate and derail and just go completely off the tracks and do a fiery, carnage-filled train wreck. And that's what David's done. So when God makes a covenant, when he makes an agreement with someone, there's always an if and then statement. You know, he's not going to come down and be like, David, you're going to rule over these people. So there's my rubber stamp. I'm going to go ahead and retire back into the clouds. You kind of do your own thing. You know, you'll know when it's time. But in the meantime, if you murder a bunch of people and you steal all their stuff and you rape their women and you take multiple wives and you get into polygamy and you abandon your countrymen in Israel and you become a treasonous traitor, it's all good, man. Because you can always come back and be the leader. I've chosen you. I don't understand it. To me, it's psychopathy. So David can't even be honest with the guy who took him under his wing. This is Achish as the chapter wraps up. He can't even be honest with this guy. Because what does he do? Achish gave him safe harbor. He gave him money. He gave him a city. He gave him a dwelling place in safety and in peace. But then what happens? Let's read it. And David saved neither man nor woman alive, in verse 11. And then this all wraps up because David says, and so will be his manner all the while he dwelleth in the country of the Philistines. He makes up a tall tale to Achish. He doesn't tell him. Did you guys notice when we read through this? He doesn't necessarily say who he attacked, who he stole all this plunder from. He just says, it's kind of in the south and, south of Judah, and did I mention Judah? Because what he's doing is he's peppering in all of these little hot button sizzle statements to Achish in order to say, hey, these were your enemies. I mean, I wasn't even going to say anything, but since you brought it up, Achish, I got a little kink in my neck here because I've been like slaughtering your enemies all day. So, you're welcome, I guess. But I'm too humble to get up on my soapbox. It was all for you. And then what does Achish say? He's like, wow, thank you very much, David. Man, what a guy. That's awesome. I really appreciate you. And so there's really no more rungs for David to climb in this country. So we'll see what unfolds after this and the verses to come. But all of that was for naught. David did not have to gain the approval of Achish. Achish already approved of him. I mean, if Achish thought that this wasn't a trustworthy dude, if he didn't gain his confidence, he wouldn't have given him a country. He would have said, get out of here. I don't really want you in my country right now. I'm the prince. I have the authority to do that. With a snap of my fingers, I can banish you. And that's not what happened. So we know that David didn't have to lie to Achish. But we know that David feels he is now beyond accountability. AKA like a Ghislaine Maxwell or a Jeffrey Epstein. These people who are basically protected and insulated to a point to where they feel, and I'm only using those names because we're familiar with them. This has happened so many times through history that we will never know about. Those are just two names out of probably millions that have made their way as a blip on the radar of the mainstream media. Remember, we don't get any information that they don't want us to have. This has all happened before. So guys, what's the wrap up? We're talking about how this is a spirit of Antichrist. This is a beast system. This is someone who laces his leadership with lies. This is David's modus operandi. Here's the wrap up. Remember, this entire ordeal started with David's failure to just pause and pray. What a simple thing that we can all do. It's free. We don't have to pay for it. We don't have to go into a prayer closet. We can do it from where we are in silence and in gratitude for God to make our supplications to him. David didn't do that. Chapter 27 kicks off within the first few words by saying he reasons within his own heart. What does the Bible say about our heart? It's wicked. It's desperate. We can't know it. As a matter of fact, the moment that we think we have control over it is our downfall, because that's where pride comes. So God warns us this is deceitful, it's desperately wicked. But unlike David thousands of years ago, and unlike the wayward Western civilization today that I've briefly spoken on, because I don't want to get too tied up in all that evil, don't follow your heart. Follow its healer. So I'll say a quick prayer. Dear God, thank you for these lessons learned painfully by other people in history so that we can avoid this foolishness, this agony, and just this ridiculous circle of repeated mistakes and injuries and bruises, not only physically but spiritually, and even upon our own reputation. We allow ourselves to get caught into this vortex of evil and pride and arrogance, like we talked about this morning. That's going to make us ineffective for you, for your mission, to speak out your words, to praise you, to share the gospel, because people aren't going to see you, they're going to see someone who's greedy of gain, someone who just says things to get whatever they want and to fill their barns up. But God, we're not worried about amassing wealth. We know that money is fake, that the love of it is the root of all evil. We just want enough to provide for our families. So God, I pray that you would bless us with peace of mind, with a strong character, that we would never get carried away or be seduced into anything as we're given responsibilities or leadership in this life, and that we would always just hit that reset button every single day, and we wouldn't try to reason with our own hearts, but we would just pray to you and lean on you for that guidance, God. So thank you for these timeless lessons that we can implement in our own time this very morning. In Jesus' name I pray, amen.